All right, there we go. So I'm going to be talking about Kveik. I have to retrain myself, because at the brewery we call this Kveik as well. This is a Norwegian strain of yeast called Kveik, and a little bit more about that a little bit later. Let's find out a little bit more about what we're actually fermenting. My name is Brian, like I said. I've been with Badger State for about 5 years. I'm currently the brewer, one of the brewers, sorry, and the director of the barrel aging program and quality assurance quality control program. I work closely with the yeast health. It's something that I'm really interested in. It's something that I'd really like to see more priority of in more breweries, because it's a really important aspect of what we do. Like Kevin said, nobody has invented fermentation. We've merely optimized it, and that's what we want to do more of. So I brought with me a few things. Pitching calculator. Pitching calculator is something that tells the brewer how much yeast you need to pitch into the wort, which is the sugary mix that you're going to make into alcohol, and cell counting. These are important functions of most brewers, and I think every brewer. But these are things that, as a brewer, we'll need to know about. So what are we fermenting? Real quick, this is the short list of how to make beer. Let's go through 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. We need a mash, which is the grains, essentially, that are cracked open and are sitting in the hot water. We do this in the cellar series, where we'll mash the grains in, and we're going to allow the enzymes to work to break down all of the starches into more usable sugars, such as glucose. Glucose, maltose, and maltotriose, most importantly. After those enzymes have worked on those starches and broken them down into usable sugars, we'll sparge that. We'll run that wort into a kettle, unless you're not boiling, of course, and you're doing a raw, no-boil fermentation. You just run that into your fermenter. But we're going to be sparging that with some hot water over the top so that we can extract all of the sugars. We're going to boil it then, unless, again, you're not doing a boil. But typically, you'll do a boil, and you'll add hops or whatever have you. We'll whirlpool it after the boil, because we want to break up the trub and the wort from each other. We want to separate them. We want to precipitate all of the coagulate and proteins out. Okay, so all of that really means nothing until you've gotten to this point. We're going to knockout, which is taking everything from the whirlpool out into the fermenter, because that's where we're going to be adding the yeast and oxygen, nutrients, and maybe something else, chocolate, fruit, who knows. So we're going to be adding the yeast now, and that's really important because that's what we're talking about tonight. So what is the fermentation process for brewing? So for us at the brewery, we take a look at 3 different phases. The first is the lag phase. I like to think about these different phases as the different periods of the day. In the morning, you gotta get your coffee, maybe do a few stretches, kind of prepare yourself for the day. You need to acclimate yourself, right? So the yeast needs to acclimate itself as well. It takes up the oxygen, which is going to help build cell wall permeability. This is important because it's going to be taking in nutrients, nitrogen, and other things like sugar, the thing that it needs to do. So we need to get it prepared to do that. This is a very short period of time within the first day. It's usually ready within 8 to 12 hours. And with Kveik, it's like 30 minutes to an hour. It's really fast. But the critical thing to note there is the oxygen. Next is the exponential phase. Exponential phase is the bulk of the fermentation. You're building biomass through the cell replication. It will be fermenting. It will drop the pH, which is super important. I said I was going to drop the word super, and I haven't done it yet. You're going to see the krausen production. The krausen is the foam that sits on top of the fermenting beer. Krausen is important because it shows you that the beer is actually doing something, and it's important to note that it's doing it early, because the earlier the production of krausen, the less likely result of bacterial growth. Brettanomyces being one of those wild yeasts that may have been an early contributor to finding alcohol. The last phase, exponential phase, in my little scenario is the 9 to 5 job. I like that one. Stationary phase is I'm done working, it's time to go to bed. This is the part of the yeast job where they get to just rest. They get to chill out, they get to collect themselves, build up their glycogen reserves, and drop out of suspension and flocculate. Flocculate's just a pretty word for fall to the bottom of the tank. And we'll sometimes run them through a diacetyl rest, depending on the strain of yeast, more so. Less so with Kveik. Hornindal doesn't necessarily need a whole lot of attention. We'll get to them guys on one of the next slides here. And then we'll cold crash the beer and get it ready for packaging. That's it, super simple, no problem, right? So this is the anaerobic respiration cycle of yeast. So is this the, oh, there we go. Okay, I've never gotten to use one of these things. This is pretty neat. So you've got your yeast process here where you take up glucose and it's going to be creating energy, and through pyruvate you will actually create one of two things, either alcohol or CO2. And it's actually interesting because when you have an anaerobic cycle, meaning there is no oxygen left to use, it actually starts to create alcohol. In the presence of oxygen, yeast doesn't do that. It actually continues to grow, it continues to acclimate, and it never really actually sits down and creates ethanol, alcohol. Hornindal. So, the bulk of what I'm here to tell you about. All of that other stuff is important because it leads up to a yeast strain, right? So this is Hornindal Kveik. Now, apparently, there are multiple ways to say Kveik. Yeah, there's a whole ton, right? If you're in northern Norway regions, apparently, or Norwegian regions, you can say Kveik, and Kveik with a little V sound is apparently okay too, but don't call it Kveik, what we do. The origin story on Hornindal Kveik is that this dude here, I'm not going to attempt to say this name because I do not disrespect, was a brewer that procured this yeast from this other guy, Mr. G. There we go. I can say Mr. R, Mr. G. See, I need him up here to say names. So through a process of training, okay, you've got this community effort between two brewers in the area. You see this transfer of ownership of this yeast. This yeast is apparently 400 to 500 years old. Which in the grand scheme of things is not necessarily super old. Well, there's that super again, sorry. It dries naturally on yeast rings. This is important to note because we don't know of any other yeasts that dry on an object and then can be reconstituted and perform exactly the way it's supposed to perform, as far as ale and lager beer production yeast goes, to my knowledge. It is a farmstead yeast, not a farmhouse yeast. When I learned this, like all of my heartstrings strummed a little bit because I come from a farm. And knowing that they're using yeasts from that person's livelihood, okay? The farmstead is the livelihood. That's where the children are born. That's where, you know, grandfather is brewing and all these, you get all these connotations and ideas, right? Farmhouse yeast is a typical style of saison yeast, which is very French, and it is much different than a farmstead yeast in the sense of what they really are. So, all that to say, we didn't find out about we didn't create fermentation. We found out about it, right? Well, we're trying to optimize it. So Kevin's got Brunch Fest. I've got On Wisconsin. My wife has got Bunyan Badger. These three beers that we brought tonight are actually Hornindal Kveik beers. Grassy Place is not. It is a different type of yeast, but of the beers that we brought, those three are. It ferments really warm. How warm? Almost 100 degrees. And that's really interesting when you think about the difference between the different strains of yeast. A lager yeast will typically ferment anywhere between 45 to maybe 60, and that's a real strong maybe. You're kind of pushing it. Ale yeast, which is a little bit closer to this Hornindal Kveik, thank you, Five, you definitely see a different sense of temperature. something closer to 65 to 75, maybe 80. And then wheat yeast is a little bit different. Anyway, 90 to 100 degrees is wild. Why that matters is because when you've got a yeast strain that says, I can only perform at this temperature, well, remember when we were acclimating to our temperature at the beginning of the day? This is why. It's taking up those sugars, it's taking up those nutrients, it's taking up that oxygen. If it's too warm, it'll produce off flavors. We don't want that. We want to create, repeatable results that are clean, easy to drink, easy to consume, enjoyable. We don't want off flavors. We don't want to taste rocket fuel. Well, too warm and it will produce rocket fuel. This guy says, nah, I'll take care of it. Don't worry about the rocket fuel. And we repeatedly ferment at very warm temperatures without rocket fuel. Anyway, pH is important because it can help to determine the morphology of the structure of the starch and the way that the enzymes interact with that. Hornindal doesn't really care about pH either. So we've got a really wide window of error that we can bypass. Apparent attenuation is the way that the yeast interacts with the maltotriose in particular and tells us how well that yeast will ferment out all of the sugars available. And the attenuation generally over 80% is really fantastic. Flocculation is that dropping out into the bottom, and alcohol tolerance, anything over 10% is ridiculous. 16% is, I'm going to say it, super ridiculous. How does Hornindal compare to, I wanted to save that for later. Oh well. How does Hornindal compare to other strains? Why does it matter? It's fast, it's clean, consistent flocculation. Storage is very flexible because you can leave it in the cooler after harvesting it. At Badger State, we reuse our yeast up to a certain point. Like I said, I'm cell counting, I'm viability testing, I'm vitality testing. I'm looking at the health parameters of the yeast. We can store this yeast for a much longer period of time than traditional ale yeast, which is important if we're trying to create more beer and increase production. Largely stress-free, oxygen seems to enjoy more oxygen. It doesn't care. Oxygen's another thing. If you've got too much oxygen in an ale yeast or a typical ale yeast, it'll burn it out, and you'll end up with more fusel alcohols. How is it similar? It's similar under the microscope. In every regard, it's fantastic. This is the yeast ring. It is basically just a wreath, 3 feet, 2 feet round with wooden blocks protruding out of it, and they dip it into the fermenting vat, take it out, it dries, the yeast is there for the next time. It's wild. This is Hornindal under the microscope, and this one little dude right here is a dead yeast cell. I was surprised to see it, so I wanted to use this picture because I typically, and this I believe was a Gen 5, meaning we've pitched this yeast 6 times, and to even see one dead yeast cell is kind of absurd because we typically don't. So when Kent and I had met and talked about me coming up here, he had said, well, hey, would you mind saying a little bit about why craft beer and craft breweries are so cool? Here's a whole bunch. I was given a 5-minute window about 6 minutes ago. The biggest thing to me is that we're part of the community. We have local teams, very small teams, and we try to be a part of the community as much as possible, hence me being here tonight. And sometimes even the yeast is local, such is the case for Hornindal Kveik. So, absolutely. Yeast is not cheap because people have figured out how to optimize the optimization. Because we're trying to optimize on making more alcohol, making more interesting brews, making more interesting experiences. There are people who know that we need to purchase into that, and they know how to upcharge that appropriately, and more power to them. We are reusing the yeast, which does bring down the cost, brings down the economics, and that reusing is similar to this, only we're using a sanitary vessel, we're reusing the same yeast. The economics of it, I can absolutely ascertain to how that would create a much cheaper way to go about it, and reusability becomes obvious. You don't have to worry about ordering your yeast. You literally just take your ring out of the yard and throw it in your, wort. which is important if you're not prepared. If you need to purchase your yeast, it has to be shipped to you. Well, if there's a silly thing like a pandemic going on, your shipping might change a little bit. So that would be definitely, I could see some advantages there, yeah.
One more question for Brian here. We had a couple of questions coming online. One was, are there any yeasts that exist in nature that are like really bad that you wouldn't want to brew with? That you know of?
Yes and no. If the question is leaning and pointing towards wild yeast and bacteria, those can be fun to play around with. Those can be fun to brew with because they create new experiences that we may not have quite yet figured out. We may not have optimized. When I was at Stone Arch Brewing Company, which I worked at before Badger State, we had a little bit of our Scottish ale wort sent to Lawrence University, and one of the professors there actually took the yeast and did this sticks thing, but literally sticks and stones, and grew spontaneous fermentation out of that, and some interesting yeast strains that we had not yet played around with, and theoretically may not have actually been before then discovered, but we did find some that were terrible and produced really off-putting results. So yes, there are yeasts and bacteria that I would not ferment with, but I won't name them because I would still like to try.
Hey, all right. Thank you very much, Brian. Well done, man.